Hi, everyone, and welcome to Chai-Side Chats, co-presented by Creativity Awakening in Jayamangala. I am your host, Aishwarya Subramanian. This is an exclusive interdisciplinary talk show featuring interviews with folks about a variety of topics whose list is ever expanding from episode to episode, but largely we touch on themes of creativity, the arts, healing, spirituality, and personal growth. Today, we are going to talk about stories, and I have with me two prolific storytellers and interdisciplinary artists on this episode. They both hold MFA degrees in theater and seek to use elements of theater and storytelling for healing, reflection, and transformation. My first guest is a critically acclaimed writer, actress, playwright, and educator whose work, which exists at the nexus of arts, wellness, and social justice, is inspired by her experiences as a person of color in the diaspora. My second guest is a creativity coach, cinematographer, and Reiki healer whose work and process in India, the Philippines, and the US has centered around intuition, rituals, and asking questions. While both of them are artists of Indian origin, their diverse backgrounds and life experiences inform and influence their approaches to creativity and how they engage with others. Please welcome Anu Yadav and Divya Rajan-Sriram. Hi, Anu. Hi, Divya. Welcome to Chai-Side Chats. Thank you guys for being here. So both of you, obviously, I mean, I've seen your work and I've kind of had the opportunity to experience it for myself. And both of you have such profound styles of storytelling that I feel really brings audiences into the world of the narrative of whatever it is that you're talking about. And, you know, given that I'm currently with two theater artists and storytellers, I'd love to begin by asking you both, what is it that makes a good or a powerful story? Are there particular elements or attributes that are really important or kind of contribute to a good story?
You know, the first thing that jumps out at me when you ask that question is truth, some degree of kind of vulnerability of that there's something of yourself in that story, it's about your own connection and emotion and passion and however that shows up, you know, what is your desire to speak and your desire to communicate to people. And that's really what comes through. And the more honest and truthful that we as storytellers can be with ourselves and why we're telling the story that we're telling, the more that clarifies not only the story, but it also catalyzes the imagination of the audience because they are really with us. Because ultimately, I think as a theater person, what people in the audience want to see is they want to see you. They want to see something that they can relate to and connect to. And when we are closed off from that, that we actually miss the opportunity of connecting with the audience and opening that kind of portal. It's a very actual spiritual thing. You know, you're setting a table, you're making a feast. You're making this beautiful feast that you have invited everybody to come sit at the table and enjoy. And they can decide what they like and if they, you know, are going gluten-free today or whatever it is, but that it's a kind of communal experience in that way.
I couldn't agree more. I think Anu just said all of it.
Yeah, I love that. I love the metaphor of like a feast or a buffet. I think that really, I think that's where the openings are in stories, right? And I think no matter what the story is, even if it is your own personal story that you're telling on stage, I think that different people will respond to different things in that or connect to different elements of that. And I think that's really, I think that's awesome because it kind of, there's a little bit for everybody depending on which levels or layers they're kind of peeling behind in the narrative of it. So yeah, I mean, kind of related to stories, I'm curious if, and this could be personal stories or any kind of myths or something, just since we, you know, touched on spirituality, but what was one of the first stories that you heard? You know, it could be when you were younger or the first time you were kind of exposed to this modality. And I'm curious to hear how that impacted you personally.
So I think for me, there were many stories. I can't quite remember which was the first story that I heard. But essentially, it was a combination of mythology and folklore. And stories for me came in the form of my grandfather. So I grew up with grandparents, and stories was part of my everyday ritual for everything, like right from waking me up in the morning. If I wouldn't wake up, my grandfather had a story to say, oh, you know about that person there and how that boy was not waking up, and do you know what happened to him because he did not wake up? And that's how my day used to start. And then moving on, there used to be a story for lunch, there used to be a story for dinner. And then over time, there were the same stories that were repeated, because I used to say, like, no, I want to listen to this story today. And and a couple of stories that I can remember is this story of a sparrow, the sparrow that found a grain of rice, and how it took the grain of rice to a different grandmother and asked them to safeguard it. And because the first grandmother loses the grain of rice, and then the sparrow picks up a fight and demands that instead of one grain of rice, the grandmother replace it with a fistful of rice. So stories such as that.
It's so interesting hearing you say that about your grandparents, because, I started thinking about the stories that my father would tell me at bedtime of kings and queens. And I actually can't remember much more other than saying kings and queens, but I'm sure there were stories there. And it also reminds me, and I just made the connection just now, of how the stories within, like, from Hinduism, from the Gita, from the Ramayana, those were the first stories that I heard, and stories may help us make meaning of the world, of our place in it, of our connection to other people, of our ability to make change in the world. And so it's just, I think it's so wonderful to be here, in community with you both, thinking about that. And I don't think I would have, I don't know, it's just useful to make that connection, just how much it's actually connected to my Hinduism.
Right. Couldn't agree more on that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because, Anu, when you were talking about how stories help us make meaning of things, right? I think one of my other questions is sort of like, and maybe you sort of started answering this already, but how important is it for stories to have underlying themes, or to have an underlying questioning of things in our day-to-day lives and societies? I mean, in other words, do stories need to have meaning, or need to have symbolism and all these existential layers of like analyzing and interpreting things that I think we as humans are so wired to do whenever we watch or read or listen to a story? Or can a story just be a story? Like, I would love to hear both of you guys' thoughts on that.
Well, I can say, a story is just a story and so much more, right? That one of my mentors likes to say that we have glass, or a kind of lens with which we view the world, that is colored by our experiences and, that have shaped us. And that when you stack all of those lenses on top of each other, you get closer to a bigger picture of truth. Because truth ultimately includes all of our experiences and realities. And as far as stories, I think they always have meaning, and there are always layers, whether or not we're clued in on those, or whether those are different for the limitations of our lens versus someone else's. So I think there's great power in that. And also stories that maybe someone intended a certain thing, but because it lives over time, and does tap into a kind of greater truth, that there's so much more meaning than even what that person in the limitations of their experience could have imagined.
There was something very interesting that I had read. This was in a book by Devdutt Patnaik, who's a famous mythologist. And like how you pointed out about the collective lenses and perspectives leads to a larger truth. He somewhat suggests something which is quite the converse of that, wherein he says that there exists a larger truth. And the stories and the myths are essentially our means to understand those larger truths. And I think stories, are very, or storytelling is very innate to humans as species, and which is where gossiping is all about. Who doesn't like to gossip? And people gossip, which is where, your point of, can stories just be stories without symbolism and without larger meanings? So that's a very innate part of our evolution. But I think when we talk about the art of storytelling, or how it translates into an art is possibly when that innateness is given a larger purpose.
That's great. I think that's so cool that you mentioned that. And I want to go back to this other point of how stories for both of you was really connected to Hinduism, and that was kind of one of your first exposures to stories, right? I think we have so many different kinds of stories in the Hindu tradition. And I am trying to avoid using the word mythology and myth, because I know that's a whole different topic, and that can be like a whole different episode. But just in terms of, religion and spirituality, I'd love to hear about your own personal relationship to those things, as well as their connection to your storytelling and your experiences as artists.
My creative practice is certainly very spiritual in many ways, also given the fact that I have been engaged in healing. And, some time back, we were talking about the artistic persona and the non-artistic persona. And here is where I see that I can't quite differentiate myself from these personas, and I have it all integrates somewhere, and which is why I think I also identify as an interdisciplinary artist. And all of this I find integrates in a very organic manner. Talking about Hinduism and spirituality, I think somewhere listening to these stories growing up has shaped the way I think in many ways. One example that I'll probably take is one of the stories that I had during my early days I had listened to, was the story of Krishna, wherein Krishna was a very mischievous kid, right? And I think the power that listening to these stories gave me was, in my imagination, I morphed myself into these characters. Okay, I visualized myself, and there was no gender barrier. I could be a male character, I could be a female character, I could even be all of them at the same time. And so one of the stories is when Krishna would have had butter, and his mother Yashoda would, he would say that I did not, and he wouldn't open his mouth. And then she would ask him to open his mouth, and when he does, she would see the universe inside his mouth, right? And I think as a child, I was so much in awe of that, to imagine like the world inside my mouth. And then today, so many years later, decades later, when I'm still the kind of healing work that I do, and the way I do use, I do a lot of work with energy. And as I do that, I'm realizing the deeper meaning of the universe being within you, or you being a very small part of the universe, and how interconnected those are.
Yeah, and hearing you say about that story, Krishna, my dad's side of the family is very connected to and worshiping Krishna. And so he and Radha were very much, icons in my childhood and in the pujas and stuff. And what I loved about Krishna is that he stole butter, he stole things. And I actually stole for a little bit when I was younger, because I was like, Krishna did it, he's a god. But I don't steal anymore, so that's great. And but the other thing, he's such a trickster god, right? He has so many different facets. He holds the universe. He's this chubby baby. He steals butter. He is a flute player. He's the guide, when Arjun having this nervous breakdown in the middle of the battlefield in the Gita. And, I wrote a play kind of inspired by Krishna. But the other thing I want to say is that as someone who's very deeply connected to a social movement, That's it really about building and backing the leadership of poor people across color lines and all lines of difference, to end poverty and all other oppressions, full stop. That one woman, this Hindu kind of organizer, was telling me that she had read, and I want to learn more about this, that the story of Krishna stealing butter, if you look back at the context of it, so don't quote me on it, but I think it's a cool thing to maybe research more, that the history of that in that context of where that and when that story emerged was that Krishna, that character, the act of him stealing butter was actually, in that context, an act of civil disobedience, because the butter was primarily made and for the king, but the people who were making it, they didn't really get to have the things that they were making, right? So it was on top of their exploitation and stuff. So the act of him stealing butter was actually a revolutionary act, and an act of justice. So I think I would love to explore more deeply what is the context from which these stories began to be told, and why were they told? What was the meaning, for people who were trying to make sense of the change that needed to happen.
The beauty of mythology is that it's ever evolving. So if I would have heard one version of the mythology and you travel across the country, each region would have its own version of it, which is highly influenced by the socio-economic and political situations that the region has seen. And in that sense, it's so open to different kinds of interpretations.
Absolutely. And I think nowadays I don't know if it's a movement, but I'm noticing a pattern, at least in terms of authors who are using stories from Hindu mythology and then kind of fictionalizing it, if that makes sense. So I guess there's some that are taking maybe minor characters from different epics in Hinduism, like, from the Ramayana, we have like Lakshmana's wife, and we never really hear about her in the dominant discourse of the whole Ramayana. And then there's a book about that perspective of that character. And I think that there's sort of more of a trend, I guess, of a lot of people taking these stories from, ancient traditions and kind of putting their own spin on it, or kind of adding elements of different societal conditioning things that were there, whether that's patriarchy or, like the civil disobedience thing that you were talking about, Anu. I think that there's a lot that's expanding in the realm of using stories from Hindu mythology.
Another thing on that is that I think what's on my mind is the times that we're living in right now. And one person said, if you wanted to choose what time of history to be alive, now is a good one because of all the things that are going on and need to change. And I'm just kind of sitting with the fact that this farmers' strike in India has been happening, and it is literally the biggest strike of workers in recorded human history. And that's massive. And so I don't know, just connected to some of the things that we're talking about and the times we're living in.
Yeah, totally. And I think, there's this whole phrase about we are living through history right now. And I mean, in total transparency, that can be very exhausting, right? Just because there's so much trauma that's happening, so much that we're surrounded by. And it can, they're important stories, I think, that'll contribute to history and to the way that future generations might see the world. But that doesn't make living through it any easier. So I want to transition a little bit and ask you both just about the different, I guess, sort of different types of stories and different ways that we can engage with them as like performing artists specifically. And, in the world of theater, there's the whole improv and improvisation is like a whole, I want to say maybe like a whole different section, and people who are specializing in that and really leaning into that as an art form. And I'd love to hear just both of your, personal preferences on whether you are drawn more towards improvised or, kind of spontaneously created stories, or you're more leaning towards like pre-scripted and pre-written stories, just when you're performing specifically?
As a performer, for me, I have mostly engaged in pre-written stories. I love to retell them. And I think what I love about that is when I pick up stories and I work with them, they may have been stories that I heard during my childhood. I may have read them, but when I work with them to perform them on stage, every time I read them and every time I work with them, there are new things about the story that emerges. And I sort of love that experience. Now, coming to improv and to makeup, I think when you are performing for a live audience, you always end up having that opportunity to make those tweaks within the story that you have prepared for.
Yeah, I definitely like both. And sometimes I actually take that storytelling into so many other contexts, because you're telling stories all the time. I'm later going to make a presentation today, and so I've scripted it out like a theatrical performance, and it actually, you talking about kind of the improvisational nature of how you're building your relationship with the audience too, and things can emerge from that. And I really like having a structure that then sometimes I can always come back to, that helps me frame things. But I'm actually remembering a moment with Rajas, the group that, Rajna and Anjana Swaminathan. So I remember performing with them, and I'd written out the script, and it was funny. We said we would end at a certain moment. And then one musician kind of didn't get the cue, so just started playing more. And so then everybody's like, okay, I guess I'll play more too. And then I was like, I guess I'll keep talking. And so I ended up kind of doing this story in it or something. And it was this amazing experience. And it really was this gift of, it was a spiritual experience to do that. And to do that with Hindu, Indian heritage women, on stage. Anyway, so I just appreciate your, reflection on scripted versus improv, and how sometimes those can merge and inform each other too.
I feel compelled to share an experience too, wherein I was performing, and there was this really small toddler in the audience. And this kid was eating popcorn, and I don't know what inspired him. While I was narrating the story, he felt inspired to walk up to the stage and offer the popcorn to me. And I think in that sense, when you engage with the medium a lot, you're not distracted by these kind of things that come up. And it just so happened that serendipitously in part of the script, one of the characters was visiting some other person, and he was being offered something to eat. And it kind of coincided with this moment when this kid came up on the stage and offered me popcorn. And the best thing I could think of doing at that point of time was just take the popcorn, eat it, and just weave it into my story. So, and that's just a magical moment. It's not something you can plan for, you can ever prepare for. But when you rehearse and you engage a lot deeply, it also prepares you to be open about situations and moments like this. So like Anu said, that it's always good to have a structure that you can go back to, but when you engage with it a lot, you are always open and flexible.
That reminds me of another story. We could keep going, but that once I was performing and some people got really mad. They were very mad at what I was doing or what I was saying. And so everybody was with me except for these people in the back, and they started shouting and they started talking back, to me. So then as the character, I was like, look, let me just finish this piece and then we'll come to you, okay, in the discussion. And it was just so interesting how you have to surf. You have to navigate all of the things where people are giving you the gift of their, kind of popcorn, or they're yelling at you. And how do you weave it in? because has to be accepted as part of the experience. People have a right to their own experience, and how do we engage with that, you know?
Totally. I think in those situations when the audience is sort of becoming involved in some way in whatever it is that the performer is presenting, I think the performer has a couple of options, right? Like you can like ignore them and not really like pay attention to what's going on and just kind of try to stay in your own process. But then there's this other opportunity or invitation that both of you guys were talking about, which is kind of bringing them in and expanding your own creativity in the process, I think. So,
you know, at this point, I kind of feel like pointing out at how storytelling seems to have diversified very clearly into, you know, stories as medicine, or stories that are narrated with healing at its core, and stories as entertainment. And it's not that one is better than the other. They both have their respective places. And somewhere I think that there was a time when both the concepts kind of overlapped each other. But with time, I think they are kind of, the gap seems to be getting more and more wider. Wherein you said, you know, that I'll just tell my story and I'll ignore the audience and I'll just be involved in my process. And or the other one is wherein you want to connect with the audience and bring about that little magical moments, which Anu had said was very spiritual in a way. And I think that is where you kind of want to question what is telling stories as entertainment, and how does it change? You know, if you want to use stories as a medium to bring about change in us, to create a better world, then, you know, does entertainment have a place in there, or should entertainment become a more responsible thing?
It's interesting you say that, because it's like a lot of the challenges I think that we face as artists, as cultural workers in these times are so reflective and connected to the increasing polarization of wealth. You know, I think we're told that, okay, there's this divide of left and right, but actually the greater divide is the fact that, you know, a few number of billionaires have made nearly 4 trillion during a pandemic that has left out most of the world in population. And, you know, you have so many poor people and more being thrown into that. So it's so interesting how, you know, it's so clear to see how stories are captivating and they can be used. You know, they can be used to sell things that people don't need, and how intractable or how confusing it can be to navigate all of that when we're fighting for our own economic conditions and material survival, but also just where capitalism and these exploitative, extractive economic systems have interfered with our ability to connect with each other, and also the kind of that genuine connection that can happen, you know, that actually is very inclusive. And there never was a separation of artists over here and you know, arts and culture has been so woven into communities as a form of resilience and healing and all these things. So it's just a really interesting, you know, interesting conversation there.
I mean, yeah. Culture has come into being because of art forms, right? Otherwise, there wouldn't be culture. And if we want to, that's where I think the oral traditions play such an important role, because they help these cultures sustain themselves.
You know, we've sort of have touched on this just over the course of our conversation, but just storytelling as an art form has evolved so much, and, you know, obviously been incorporated in so many different fields, and it, whether or not it's intentional as it was back in the day, or equitable as it probably should be, is, you know, debatable and questionable. But I think the fact that it has sustained is something, right? I think that it kind of shows that that storytelling is powerful, that stories are powerful, and people are using them for various different purposes and various reasons. So I want to transition now into our experiential activity. I think we've done a lot of talking and a lot of really deep and thought-provoking discussion about different elements of stories and just how they've touched both of you, and heard stories from you about your performance experiences, which was really nice. So for our activity today, we are going to do, surprise, surprise, collaborative storytelling. And the way this is going to work is one of us can start, one person will start with a sentence, and then each of us will kind of take turns and alternate and say one line at a time to just continue adding and building to the story based on what the previous people have said. It doesn't matter if it makes sense logically or has any kind of deeper meaning or significance like we were sort of talking about earlier. My intention is just to have us kind of play and exercise our improv muscle and our imaginations and just to have fun with it. So yeah, that's kind of what we are going to do. Any questions?
You said just one line each?
Yeah, we'll do one line each.
Great.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. And yeah, I want to open it up and just invite you to make it as interdisciplinary or intermodal as you would like. I know both of you incorporate different art forms into your own performance and storytelling experiences. So if you want to sing or if you want to dance or incorporate some props or anything like that, you are absolutely welcome to do so, just to make it whatever it is that you're feeling in the moment. So anybody feeling a strong idea coming forth? Who wants to start?
Well, once there was a mushroom that wanted to fly.
So it prayed to its best friend, the earth, to help it find its way into the sky.
But unfortunately, its best friend, Earth, had no way to help this poor mushroom who wanted to fly.
So the earth said, go to the ocean. Maybe the ocean will have some ideas.
But the mushroom didn't have any means to go to the ocean.
The earth said, don't worry, I will take you. I'm really good friends with the soil.
And in that moment, clouds started to form and drops started to fall. The ocean came down in the form of a rainfall.
So the mushroom asked the ocean if there was a way that it could help it fly. And the ocean said, oh, you need to ask the sky.
So the mushroom prayed to the sky and looked up and requested that it grant its wish of wanting to fly.
And then a bird came by and then pooped on the mushroom.
And the mushroom wasn't sure if it wanted to fly because the fact that the bird pooped on it kind of put it off. And the mushroom didn't want to do that to anybody else.
So the mushroom was a little sad for a few days. He stayed in his little corner. He cried. He didn't know what to do. And he felt really helpless.
And the rainfall came again to wash away the debris and poop, so the mushroom could be clear.
And that's when it noticed the tree upon whose roots the mushroom was growing, listened to the tree for the first time. And there was something very valuable the tree was trying to tell the mushroom.
The tree told the mushroom, trust the process. Trust your wish. It will happen one day.
And as the mushroom heard the rustling of the leaves in the tree, the mushroom realized, maybe I'm just right as I am rooted in the earth. Maybe either I don't need to fly, or maybe there are other ways of flying, or maybe I'm just fine as I am.
Yes. The mushroom realized that flying was just a metaphor, and it found other ways of flying.
So the mushroom continued to live at the roots of the tree with the wisdom of all the different elements around it, happily ever after. Yay!
That's so great. That was so fun.
That was fun. How was that activity?
We are the mushroom. No.
We are the mushroom.
We are fine as we are.
I love it. I love it.
I think it's so much fun to just very, very deliberately be vulnerable and not think about who is going to think what or who's going to judge you, and just say whatever comes to your mind. To be a little child and just run wild with your imagination.
I really liked it too, because I think oftentimes, it's so nice to be talking about stories, because a lot of times I feel as artists, a lot of the work we're doing is like all the other things to make space for the art, And so to kind of remember and rekindle that sense of play, that again, there's nothing to prove and no one to please. It's just a way to play and to connect with other people. So that's very joyful. And awesome. So deep too. We were still there's a meaning. Our brains work that way, right? Like,
yeah.
That's a story about a mushroom, but it's really about ourselves.
We are the mushroom.
We are the mushroom.
We are the mushroom.
Yeah, I love it. I'm so glad you both enjoyed it. I think I'm calling this agenda-less art making, because I think as creators, when we are putting something together for a show or for a particular event, I think there's always an agenda, right? Or there's some kind of intention, something that's pushing us in a particular direction. And it's in one of my previous episodes, musician Rajna, she talked about art as play and how that can be really powerful. And I think that, we definitely tapped into that today. So that was very exciting. Thank you both so much for being on this episode. It's been such a pleasure chatting with you both and diving into the world of stories with stories. And we ended with the story as well. I just want to wish you both all the best with your work and hope that your creativity will continue to awaken, flow, and find expression in whatever it is that you do. So thank you so much for being here. Hi everyone, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Chai Side Chats about stories with Divya and Anu. Please do like, share, and subscribe to the Creativity Awakening YouTube channel for regular updates. Episodes for Chai Side Chats premiere every 2 weeks. Stay tuned, next one is coming soon.